The sun rose blood-red over the fields of Crécy on that August morning in 1346, and by noon it would set on the corpses of 10,000 men. But here's the thing that should make your stomach turn. This wasn't some apocalyptic battle that historians mark as a turning point in human civilization. This was Tuesday, just another Tuesday in the endless, grinding machinery of medieval warfare. Picture this scene, if you will. The finest warriors Europe could produce, men who had trained since childhood to become living weapons, charging across muddy fields toward their deaths with all the inevitability of water flowing downhill. These weren't desperate peasants conscripted at knife point. These were knights' professional killers who represented decades of investment, years of training, fortunes spent on equipment, and they were about to die like flies hitting a window. Among the Welsh mercenaries standing with the English army that day was a young man named Dafydd ap Gwilym, son of a shield-maker from the valleys of Wales. Now, Dafydd wasn't supposed to be thinking about economics while watching the flower of French nobility prepare to charge to their deaths. He was supposed to be thinking about honour, about glory, about the righteous cause of his English employers. But Dafydd had the misfortune, or perhaps the blessing, of having been raised by merchants and craftsmen, people who understood that wasting resources was the closest thing to a mortal sin you could commit in business. And what he was watching was the greatest waste of resources in human history. Think about this for a moment. To create one knight, one single armoured warrior required approximately 20 years of training and education. 20 years. That's longer than most people today spend in school and university combined. Add to that the cost of equipment. A full suit of armour cost roughly £300 sterling in 14th century money. To put that in perspective, that's enough to buy a decent-sized farm, or support a family of 6 for 3 years, or purchase the services of 50 archers for an entire campaign season. £300, 20 years of training. And the average battlefield life expectancy? If you were lucky, maybe 30 seconds from the moment the charge began until a crossbow bolt or longbow arrow found the gaps in that expensive armour. Dafydd watched the French knights organising themselves into their traditional formations, their banners snapping in the wind, their armour gleaming like mirrors in the morning sun. He could practically hear his merchant uncle's voice in his head, calculating the waste. 30 knights dead in the first minute. That's £9,000 of equipment alone, not counting the cost of raising them from boys. His uncle had always said that the only true sin in business was throwing away something valuable for no good reason. The English longbowmen peasants, most of them, men who learned their trade hunting rabbits and deer, began loosing their arrows in great grey clouds that darkened the sky, and those magnificent, expensive, gloriously trained knights began falling like wheat before the scythe. The sound was something Dafydd would never forget, not just the screams of men and horses, but the metallic crash of all that precious armour hitting the ground, now worth nothing more than scrap metal to be stripped from corpses. This is where it gets truly insane from an economic perspective. Each dead knight represented not just his own lost value, but all the resources that would now have to be spent replacing him. The widow's pension, the orphaned children who would need support, the village that had invested in his training and would now get nothing back on that investment. Meanwhile, the English archers who were doing most of the killing? They cost perhaps 5 shillings each to outfit, and could be trained to deadly effectiveness in 6 months. The French charged 3 times that day. 3 times! As if somehow the 4th charge would magically overcome the same tactical problems that had destroyed the first 3. Dafydd watched noble after noble lead their men into the same slaughter, and each time he found himself doing the mathematics of destruction in his head. By evening, the flower of French chivalry lay scattered across the field like dropped coins, and the widows and orphans were multiplying faster than graves could be dug. But here's what really got to Dafydd, what would haunt him for years afterward. The Church taught that dying gloriously in battle was a guaranteed ticket to heaven. Die courageously for your Lord, die in service to God's anointed King, and eternal salvation was yours. It was a beautiful theology, really, except for one small problem: heaven seemed to be remarkably expensive. All those souls ascending to paradise left behind a trail of economic devastation that would ripple through European society for generations. That night, as the professional looters moved across the battlefield like vultures, stripping armor from corpses and counting coins from purses. Dafydd found himself sitting by the campfire with a piece of charcoal and a smooth stone. His fellow mercenaries were drinking and celebrating, dividing their shares of the loot. But Dafydd was drawing shield formations in the mud, sketching out patterns and angles, obsessing over a thought that felt almost heretical in its simplicity. What if soldiers were meant to survive? His companions mocked his coward's drawings. Real warriors didn't think about living through battles, they thought about dying well. But Dafydd remembered something his grandfather used to say, back when he was learning the shieldmaker's trade. A living dog serves his master better than a dead lion. The traditional shield wall, the basic defensive formation that had been unchanged since Roman times, was crumbling under the impact of new weapons like sand castles before the tide. Crossbows, longbows, new styles of cavalry charges, improved siege engines, everything was evolving except the fundamental way that foot soldiers protected themselves and each other. As Dafydd sat there in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the sounds of dying men calling for their mothers and the clink of coins being counted from dead men's purses, he began to understand something that would change the face of European warfare forever. The system was broken. Not just militarily broken, but economically broken, socially broken, spiritually broken. Something had to change, or European nobility would literally bleed itself into extinction within a few generations. And maybe, just maybe, the answer lay not in dying more gloriously, but in living more intelligently. But first, he would have to convince the most honor-obsessed, tradition-bound, glory-seeking warriors in human history that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is survive to fight another day. The question that would drive everything that followed was simple. How do you teach dead men to live? The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm in 1348, 2 years after Crecy, when Dafydd ap Gwilym was huddled under the roof of a shepherd's hut in the Welsh hills. The rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the slate tiles above his head, and as he watched the water streaming off the roof, something clicked in his mind like a key turning in a lock. Not one drop was penetrating the roof. Not one. And why? Because the tiles overlapped in perfect harmony, each one protecting its neighbour, each angle calculated to send the water sliding away rather than allowing it to pool and penetrate. The rain nature's most persistent force was being defeated not by the strength of individual tiles, but by their cooperation, their geometry, their ability to work as a unified system. What if shields could work the same way? Now, here's where Dafydd's idea gets truly revolutionary. The traditional shield wall had been the backbone of European infantry tactics for over 1,000 years. Picture a line of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each holding a shield in front of his body, creating what looked like a solid barrier. It seemed logical, it looked impressive, and it had worked well enough against swords and spears. But against the new weapons of the 14th century crossbows that could punch through armor, longbows that rained death from the sky, new cavalry tactics that hit like sledgehammers, the static shield wall crumbled like week old bread. Dafydd's insight was that shields shouldn't just protect, they should deflect, redirect, and distribute force. If shields could overlap and rotate like living scales on some great armored beast, impact forces would spread across the entire formation, rather than concentrating on individual points. Instead of a wall, you'd have an organism. Instead of static defense, you'd have dynamic protection. But here's the problem. Who was going to test this crazy theory? Knights certainly weren't interested in listening to tactical advice from a Welsh craftsman's son. Professional soldiers had their own methods. Thank you very much. Methods proven by centuries of tradition. So Dafydd had to find his recruits among the desperate, the discarded, the men who had nothing left to lose. His first volunteers were a collection that would have made any respectable military commander weep. Crippled veterans who couldn't fight in traditional formations because missing fingers or twisted arms prevented them from holding weapons properly. Landless younger sons who couldn't afford proper equipment, but were willing to try anything that might give them an edge. Criminals offered pardons in exchange for military servicemen who understood that survival often mattered more than honor. They trained in abandoned quarries outside Pembroke, places where the sound of clashing metal wouldn't attract attention from authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about unauthorized military experimentation. The locals called them Dafydd's dancing fools because of the way they moved, not the straight-line charges and static positions of traditional warfare, but fluid, coordinated movements that looked almost like some deadly folk dance. The shields themselves required complete redesign. Traditional shields were built for individual protection, heavy, sturdy, designed to absorb punishment. Dafydd's shields needed to be lighter for rapid movement, but with reinforced edges that could lock with neighbouring shields. The leather straps had to allow for quick angle adjustments, and the metal bosses, those central decorative elements, were redesigned to interlock with the bosses of adjacent shields, creating a system where dozens of individual shields could function as a single adaptive surface. Communication became absolutely crucial. In traditional warfare, once the fighting started, individual soldiers were essentially on their own, but Dafydd's rotating turtle, as his men started calling it, required split-second coordination between dozens of fighters. They developed a system of drum beats to synchronize rotations, trumpet calls to signal major formation changes, and designated voices, men whose job was to shout specific commands that everyone had memorized through endless repetition. Picture this in action. 60 men moving across a battlefield like a single organism, their shields creating an overlapping surface that rippled and flowed as arrows struck it. When a crossbow bolt hit the formation, instead of punching through one man's shield and killing him, the impact would be absorbed and distributed across multiple shields, the force redirected harmlessly away. When cavalry charged, instead of standing firm and hoping for the best, the formation would rotate and flex, allowing the horses to slide past, like water flowing around a stone. The noble observers who occasionally witnessed these training sessions were not impressed. Dancing peasants, they called Dafydd's men, cowards who've forgotten how to stand and fight like men. The criticism stung, especially since many of Dafydd's recruits were veterans who had proven their courage in traditional battles and carried the scars to prove it. But then came Pontvalin in 1370. A bridge needed to be held. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make the history books just a stone bridge over a muddy river that controlled access to a strategically important valley. The local commander had 60 men available, and orders to hold the position against whatever force the enemy might send. Under normal circumstances, 60 men couldn't hope to hold a bridge against a determined attack by superior numbers. They'd fight bravely, die honourably, and be remembered in songs that no one would sing. Instead, something unprecedented happened. 300 traditional fighters, knights, men-at-arms, professional soldiers equipped with the finest weapons money could buy charged that bridge for 6 hours. 6 hours, and when the sun set, 4 of Dafydd's men were dead, 12 were wounded, and 90 attackers lay sprawled across the bridge and the approaches to it. The Black Prince himself witnessed the final hour of that defence. Prince Edward, son of King Edward III, heir to the English throne, a man who had commanded at Crecy and knew more about warfare than most people knew about breathing. He arrived expecting to find heroic corpses, and instead found exhausted but living soldiers calmly tending their wounded while enemy survivors limped away in defeat. His first reaction was fury. This wasn't how warfare was supposed to work. Where was the glorious charge? Where were the individual acts of heroism? Where was the chivalric display that separated noble warriors from common rabble? But his military advisor, a practical man who understood mathematics better than mythology, was already doing calculations in his head. Preserve your soldiers, and the advantages compound exponentially. 60 men who survive today can fight tomorrow, and next week, and next month. They can train recruits, pass on their experience, form the core of larger formations. Dead heroes make inspiring songs but terrible teachers. Word of Pontvalin spread through military camps like wildfire, but not openly. This kind of innovation threatened too many established interests, challenged too many sacred traditions. Instead, the knowledge travelled in whispers, in secret midnight training sessions, in folk songs with hidden meanings that taught tactical instructions disguised as entertainment. Turn with the sun, lock with your brother, let death slide past like water off stone. Traditional weaponsmiths found their orders for heavy armor mysteriously declining as soldiers began to value mobility over protection. Meanwhile, shield makers willing to adapt their craft to Dafydd's specifications discovered they couldn't produce enough equipment to meet demand. The revolution had begun, but it was a quiet revolution, spreading through the ranks like a beneficial plague. And like all true revolutions, it was about to change everything. But first, it had to survive the reaction of those who profited from the old ways of dying. The moment when military curiosity became continental revolution can be pinpointed to a single day: the Siege of Limoges in 1370. What happened there didn't just change tactics, it changed the mathematics of power itself. Picture the scene. 3,000 traditional fighters, the cream of French military nobility, surrounding 300 men using Dafydd's rotating turtle formation. By every rule of medieval warfare, this should have been a massacre lasting perhaps an hour. The defenders should have died gloriously, the attackers should have claimed victory at acceptable cost, and the chroniclers should have recorded another standard tale of chivalric triumph. Instead, something happened that shattered the fundamental assumptions of how war worked. Those 300 defenders held their position for an entire day. When the sun finally set, 20% of them were casualties, 60 men dead or wounded. In any previous era, that would have been considered catastrophic losses. But here's the thing that made military commanders across Europe wake up in cold sweats. Traditional warfare would have produced 80% casualties. In a conventional defense, 240 of those 300 men would have been dead. Let me put this in terms that would have made medieval accountants weep with joy. Under the old system, defending that position would have cost 240 trained soldiers. Under Dafydd's method, it cost 60. That's not just an improvement, that's a revolution in military economics so profound it changed the balance of power between entire kingdoms. Prince Edward, despite his earlier skepticism about these dancing peasants, immediately grasped the implications. Within weeks, orders went out through the English army. Every unit was to be trained in the rotating turtle technique, not as a supplement to traditional tactics, but as the new standard. The prince wasn't interested in honor or tradition, he was interested in winning, and winning meant keeping his soldiers alive to fight again tomorrow. But of course, military secrets have a way of not staying secret. French spies were frantically trying to steal the technique, offering enormous bribes to English deserters who could demonstrate the shield rotations and formation changes. Italian mercenary captains sent agents to observe English training sessions from hidden positions. German princes dispatched their best military minds to study reports from the Siege of Limoges. The spread of Dafydd's innovation followed the iron logic of economics. Kingdoms that continued bleeding gold to constantly replace their armies simply couldn't compete with those that preserved their investments in human capital. It was that simple, and that devastating to the old order. At Ruzebeke, in 1382, French forces employing adapted versions of Dafydd's system turned what should have been a slaughter into a strategic victory. The Flemish rebels, expecting to face traditional French cavalry charges, instead encountered formations that absorbed their attacks like water, soaking into cloth, then struck back with coordinated counterattacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. 3 years later, at Aljubarrota in 1385, the Portuguese provided the most spectacular demonstration yet of the new warfare's potential. Outnumbered 5-1 by a Castilian invasion force, the Portuguese should have been crushed like insects under a boot. Instead, using perfected turtle formations integrated with strategic terrain advantages, they destroyed an army 5 times their size while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The mathematics of medieval warfare had fundamentally shifted. Commanders could now plan campaigns lasting months rather than days, knowing their core forces would survive individual battles. This wasn't just about tactics, it was about strategy on a scale that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Think about the cascading advantages this created. Experienced soldiers who survived battles could train recruits in advanced tactics rather than just teaching basic survival skills. Wounded men who would have died from treatable injuries in the chaos of traditional slaughter now had time to be evacuated and treated properly. Battlefield surgeons, who had previously spent most of their time writing death certificates, suddenly found themselves actually practicing medicine on patients they could save. The preservation of experienced soldiers created what modern military theorists would recognize as force multiplication. One veteran who had survived multiple battles using the rotating turtle was worth 10 raw recruits in terms of tactical knowledge, unit cohesion, and training capability. Armies that adopted Dafydd's methods early found themselves with an exponentially growing advantage over those that clung to traditional approaches. The social implications were equally profound. Noble families that embraced the new techniques found their bloodlines strengthened as younger sons survived to establish cadet branches and marry into other houses. Traditional noble families that insisted on glorious but suicidal charges watched their male lines extinguished within a generation or two. Consider the economic ripple effects that spread throughout European society. Stable military forces meant predictable taxation. Kingdoms didn't have to constantly levy emergency taxes to replace destroyed armies. Reduced recruitment meant more agricultural workers stayed on their farms, improving food production and rural economic stability. Surviving soldiers brought home innovations and knowledge from foreign campaigns, spreading technological and cultural advances across the continent. The transformation reached beyond purely military applications. Noble courts that had previously been dominated by young men eager to prove themselves in battle now included experienced veterans who had seen enough warfare to value diplomatic solutions. The constant cycle of blood feuds and revenge wars that had plagued medieval Europe began to slow as families realized that preserving their sons might be more valuable than avenging their fathers. Weapons production shifted dramatically. Armorers found their orders changing from heavy, protective gear designed to keep men alive for a few extra seconds, to lighter, more flexible equipment that prioritized mobility and formation fighting. Shield makers who adapted to Dafydd's DFD specifications became wealthy, while those who insisted on traditional designs found their workshops empty. The Church, surprisingly, adapted to the new reality with remarkable speed. Theology that had emphasized glorious death in battle began to incorporate concepts of stewardship and preservation of God's gifts. If God had given men the intelligence to develop better defensive techniques, surely using those techniques was a form of divine service rather than cowardice. Training camps across Europe began to resemble dance academies more than traditional military schools. The sight of armored soldiers moving in precise, coordinated patterns while drummers beat out complex rhythms became commonplace. What had once been mocked as peasant dancing was now studied by the finest military minds of the age. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For over 1,000 years, European warriors had been trained to think of themselves as individually heroic but ultimately expendable. The new way of fighting required soldiers to think of themselves as valuable components of a larger system, men whose survival was crucial to the mission's success. By 1390, less than 20 years after Pontvalin, Dafydd's innovations had reduced battlefield casualties by an average of 80% wherever they were properly implemented. 80%! Entire bloodlines that would have been extinguished continued to flourish. Kingdoms that would have bled themselves into weakness remained strong and stable. The Welsh shieldmaker's son had accidentally solved one of medieval Europe's greatest problems: how to fight wars without destroying the societies that fought them. But the true measure of his achievement wouldn't be visible for generations, when the children and grandchildren of soldiers who survived because of the rotating turtle would reshape the world in ways that medieval minds couldn't have imagined. When Dafydd ap Gwilym died in 1391, he was surrounded by 4,000 men who owed him their lives. Not metaphorically, literally. These were soldiers who could point to specific battles, specific moments, when the rotating turtle formation had saved them from death or crippling injury. They came from across Europe to pay their respects to the Welsh craftsman's son who had taught an entire continent that survival was more valuable than glory. His funeral wasn't recorded in any royal chronicle. No bishop delivered a sermon about his noble sacrifice for God and king, but 4,000 veterans stood in silent formation around his grave, their shields locked in the pattern he had taught them, creating a wall of steel and leather that could have held against any force on earth. It was the most impressive military honor guard in medieval history, and almost no one with political power even knew it was happening. By the time of Dafydd's death, his innovation had reduced battlefield casualties by 80%, wherever it was properly implemented. 80%. Stop and think about what that means in human terms. In a traditional medieval battle, if you started with 1,000 men, you expected to finish with 200 alive and functional. Using Dafydd's techniques, you'd end with 800. That's 600 fathers who went home to their children, 600 sons who lived to carry on family lines, 600 sets of skills and experiences that remained available to society instead of rotting in mass graves. The rotating turtle had evolved far beyond its original conception. What started as a simple defensive formation had become the foundation for sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and missile troops in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Mounted knights learned to work with defensive infantry rather than charging independently to glorious death. Archers and crossbowmen learned to coordinate their fire with shield rotations, creating devastating synchronized attacks that could shatter traditional formations. Military treatises of the 15th century universally acknowledged what Dafydd had discovered through bitter experience. Preserving trained soldiers multiplied force effectiveness exponentially. One veteran was worth 10 recruits, not just in terms of individual skill, but in terms of unit cohesion, tactical knowledge, and the ability to train others. Armies that preserved their experienced core could grow stronger with each campaign, while those that followed traditional methods grew weaker even in victory. The technique's influence reached far beyond battlefields. Consider the social transformation. Surviving educated nobles founded universities instead of dying young in pointless charges. Merchant soldiers invested their profits in trade ventures, rather than leaving everything to support widows and orphans. The Renaissance's human-centered philosophy grew partly from soil fertilized by military pragmatism that valued individual life over abstract concepts of honor. Specific bloodlines tell the story better than any strategic analysis. The Somerset branch of the Beaufort family existed only because John Beaufort survived the Battle of Agincourt, using shield rotation tactics, instead of joining the suicidal cavalry charge that killed most of the English nobility. His descendants included 2 queens of England and shaped royal policy for 3 centuries. Multiply that story by thousands, and you begin to understand how one man's cowardly innovation literally changed the genetic makeup of European aristocracy. The Spanish tercio formations that dominated European battlefields for 2 centuries traced their lineage directly back to Dafydd's principles. Those massive infantry squares that made Spain the premier military power of the 16th century were essentially scaled-up versions of the rotating turtle, adapted for gunpowder weapons and New World conquests. Swiss pike squares, German Landsknecht formations, English longbow tactics all incorporated rotating defensive elements that made them nearly invincible against traditional medieval charges. Military historians have calculated that Dafydd's innovation preserved approximately 300,000 lives during the late medieval period. 300,000 men who lived instead of dying, who went on to father children, build businesses, create art, advance human knowledge. Those lives rippled forward through the generations, multiplying exponentially until millions of people alive today owe their existence to a Welsh shieldmaker's son who was obsessed with economic efficiency. The irony is delicious. Dafydd set out to solve a business problem, the wasteful destruction of valuable human resources, and accidentally triggered one of the greatest social revolutions in European history. The preservation of military experience led to technological advancement, political stability, economic growth, and cultural flowering that laid the groundwork for everything we recognize as the modern world. Modern military forces still study Dafydd's core principles. Riot police around the world practice shield rotations based on 14th century manuals. Navy SEALs train in overlapping defensive patterns that would have been instantly recognizable to veterans of Pont Valais. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst teach DAFID's fundamental insight. Victory means accomplishing your objectives while preserving your forces for tomorrow's challenges. The principle has evolved beyond military applications. Modern business strategy emphasizes sustainable competitive advantage over short-term victories that damage long-term capabilities. Sports teams that preserve their star players through intelligent rotation and injury prevention outperform those that burn out their talent for immediate glory. Even video game designers incorporate DAFID's logic, rewarding players for keeping their units alive rather than throwing them away in Pyrrhic victories. But perhaps the most important lesson of DAFID's legacy is philosophical. For most of human history, courage has been defined as willingness to die for a cause. DAFID introduced a radical alternative. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is live intelligently for a cause. Sometimes the greatest heroes aren't those who die gloriously, but those who survive to continue the fight another day. His innovation challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval culture, which valued individual honor over collective effectiveness, glorious death over pragmatic survival, traditional methods over innovative solutions. The fact that his ideas not only survived but transformed an entire civilization proves that human beings are capable of learning, adapting, and choosing wisdom over tradition when the stakes are high enough. In the end, Dafydd ap Gwilym succeeded in teaching dead men to live, not by raising the corpses that littered medieval battlefields, but by creating a system where far fewer men became corpses in the first place. He proved that the greatest military innovation isn't always a new weapon or a more effective way to kill. Sometimes it's a better way to preserve the most precious resource any society has, the lives and experience of its people. The dancing shields are silent now, their last practitioners buried centuries ago. But the principle they embodied, that survival and victory aren't opposites, but partners, continues to shape how humanity approaches every form of conflict, from corporate boardrooms to international diplomacy. And somewhere in the Welsh hills, if you know where to look, you can still find the abandoned quarry where a craftsman's son first taught desperate men that living intelligently was more valuable than dying gloriously. The stone walls still echo with the ghost of ancient drumbeats, the rhythm that once synchronized shield, rotations, and changed the world. Turn with the sun, lock with your brother, let death slide past like water off stone. That rhythm beats on in every heart that chooses survival over surrender, adaptation over tradition, intelligent preservation over glorious waste. It beats in the heart of every teacher who prioritizes their students' growth over their own recognition, every leader who builds for the future rather than claiming immediate glory, every person who understands that the most heroic thing you can do is live well enough to fight tomorrow's battles. Dafydd ap Gwilym died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by men who lived because he taught them how. In a culture obsessed with glorious death, that might be the most revolutionary act of all.